Yogah Karmasu Kaushalam.
We are aware of the fact that unto the end of 1960, views on language learning were derived from the theory of learning in general. The dominant school in psychology which informed most discussions on language learning was behaviorism. The two important concepts that this theory dealt with were habits and errors. Theorists such as Thorndike, Bloomfield, Skinner considered language as a set of habit formation and hence felt that language could be learned by imitation and reinforcement. According to them, whenever stimulus was provided to learners, they were expected to respond in the same manner. If the desired outcome were obtained, the response would get further consolidated when learners were rewarded. Theories of habit formation were thus theories of language learning which could be applied to understand language learning. Now let's clarify this concept further. Meeting someone calls for a certain kind of response or behavior which would or could be some kind of greeting. And if the greeting is understood, it means that the desired response was obtained. If the responses were appropriate, it would be reinforced with a reward which helped to strengthen the association. In case the communication was not appropriate, the learner would have to abandon the response in favor for another acceptable one. In learning the first language, the child learns a set of new habits as he or she learns to respond to stimuli. It was said that the children mastered their mother tongue by imitating utterances produced by the adults and thus either got rewarded or punished. In this manner, the children built up patterns or habits that constituted learning the language. Now to look at the impact of behaviorist theory on second language acquisition, it was believed that SLA was proceeded in similar manner. Imitation and reinforcement were tools by which the learner identified the stimulus-response association which constituted L2 habits. It was felt that language could be broken into various parts, various stimuli and response links, and learning could take place when these links were systematically practiced and mastered. Habit formation theory thus dominated second language acquisition up to the 1960s. However, there was another perspective to this theory of learning. It was regarding the errors that were committed while learning a second language. According to behaviorists, old habits, that is L1 habits, intruded into the process of learning L2 habits. Learners already had a set of well-established responses in their mother tongue or L1, and learning the second language involved replacing the well-established habits with a set of new ones. The notion of interference thus became central to the behaviorist account of second language acquisition. According to Lero, if structures in second language were similar to those of L1, learning would take place easily. But if structures were realized differently, learning L2 would be difficult and an error was likely to occur. We know from the observation of many cases that grammatical structures of the native language tends to be transferred to the foreign language. We have here the major source of difficulty or ease in learning foreign language. Those structures that are different will be difficult. For Ellis, it was the result of what was called proactive inhibition. Proactive inhibition meant the way in which previous learning inhibits or prevents learning of new habits. L2 learners are hypnotized to experience difficulty in acquiring target language forms that are different from their first language forms. But it is possible that the structure used for expressing the intent is similar as in first and second language. In that case, learning will take place because the realization device is same in both languages. An example will make this a little more clear. An English learner learning French as a second language wants to say, I am 12 years old. But she is likely to say, je dois, which means I have 12 years old. The same structure in German could be said as,
Ich bin 12 Jahre alt, which means I am 12 years old. You can see from the above example that the meaning of structure in French is different from that of the English structure, while the meaning is the same as that of English. According to the behaviorist, therefore, the German structure would be easier to learn than the French one because the English structure acts as a facilitator to learn German, the structure being the same, while it acts as an inhibitor in the other. Behaviorist learning predicted that from first language to second language, either positive or negative transfer would take place. It could be a negative transfer as in the case of French, or it could be a positive transfer as in the case of German. These errors were considered undesirable because they thought that these habits were likely to become systemic, resulting in learning of L2. To sum up the view mentioned that errors represented a failure to learn a new set, errors, if allowed to continue, would become set of habits since language learning was considered habit and formation. And errors were caused by interference whereby features of L1 were carried over or transferred into the L2 by the learner. Researchers like Lado and Fries stated categorically that reasons for errors made by learners could be predicted by comparing systematically the language and culture to be learnt with the native language and the culture of the learner. The theory of contrastive analysis stated that a systematic analysis of L1 and L2, which is the target language, in terms of the level of sound systems, including vowels, consonants, stress, placement or intonation, and word formation such as inflection, derivation, compounding, along with syntax, word order, agreement concord, transformation, and semantics such as assigning meanings to utterances and conversely creating utterances to convey particular meanings, can offer complete explanation of the causes of errors and is also likely to predict the errors learners are going to make. For example, let us look at some errors Hindi speaking learners are likely to make while learning English. If we compare the phonological systems of Hindi and English language, we find there are several sounds in English which are not there in Hindi, like the sounds represented in words like treasure, leisure, pleasure. Similarly, the vowel sounds in day, way, home, stone have no equivalence in Hindi. This means that the Hindi speaking learner will face difficulty in mastering these particular sounds. A contrastive analysis of both language further shows that Hindi has some system of stress placement on different syllables of words, which is an important feature of the English language. Because of this feature in English, if stress is altered in certain words, they acquire a different meaning. On syntactic level, it is observed most Indian languages, including Hindi, do not have a parallel system of articles. The result is that the students are unable to master the rules governing the use of definite, indefinite and zero articles. As a teacher, when we notice their written work, we come to know that they hardly use any articles while writing. Even at the level of question formation, we can see differences. Notice the set of sentences given below. We would want you to take a look at these sentences. From an affirmative, in Hindi, only the question word is inserted after the subject of the sentence. The other word order remains the same. But in English, when question forms are constructed, two changes take place. One, there is an addition of a question word at the beginning of the sentence. Two, there is a change in the order of the words. The position of the subject undergoes a change and is moved after the auxiliary verb. The Hindi speakers face problem in learning this structure. After adding the question word, these students fail to change the word order of the rest of the sentence. Despite teaching the rules, the Hindi speaker continues to say, where is he going, why is he going, instead of the correct form, where is he going, why is he going. Thus, contrastive analysis helps us to understand and identify the possible areas in which the learner of second language is likely to face problems.
The manner in which contrastive analysis has impacted Indian classrooms will be dealt separately in the final section of this module. However, with this theoretical input, teachers can prepare suitable teaching materials, plan drills and exercises so that problem areas can be taken care of and learners can learn second language effectively and appropriately. This school of language learning came under severe criticism as fields of linguistics and psychology witnessed major development. A shift from structural linguistics, which was based on the description of the surface structure of a large corpus of language, to generative linguistics, which emphasized the rule, governed and creative nature of human language. In psychology, the preeminent role of environment in shaping the child's learning and behavior, as argued by Skinner, lost ground in favor of the more developmentalist views of learning, such as Piaget's cognitive development theory, in which it was argued that it was the inner forces of the child in interaction with the environment which results in language learning. The next one is the mentalist view on L1 and L2 acquisition. The claim of the mentalist that acquisition of L1 was based on learners' internal factors was drawn from the works of a number of psychologists and linguistics, of whom the claims and observations made by Chomsky and Lenneberg were prominent and served as a framework for future investigation. The key concepts of the mentalist view were the critical period and the creativity of learners. Talking about the critical period, Lenneberg propounded the concept of critical period in 1967. He emphasized that learning a language acquired biological prerequisites which he called the critical period. He argued that a child's brain was specially adapted to process language acquisition, but this innate propensity was lost as maturation took place. He used the results of his studies of aphasia, loss of language function due to brain damage, which showed that total recovery of language functions was not possible once puberty was reached. The biological argument was that unto puberty, adolescence, the two hemispheres of the cerebral cortex does not acquire lateralization that characterizes the adult brain. Having received a neurological sanction, he further argued that there was an age of resonance during which language acquisition took place as a genetic heritage. Lenneberg's work thus provided empirical and theoretical support for the concept of built-in capacity for language as a part of every human being's biological endowment. According to the mentalists, language acquisition was a universal process, which meant that there was a sequence of development and there were factors that determine how acquisition took place. The research which was conducted in the 1960s on first language acquisition, known as FLA, revealed that there was more or less fixed sequence of development of language through which all learners pass to achieve adult competence. What were these stages of development? These stages of development were the sequence of learning did individual learners follow. Eichmann summarized the stages as follows: language stage, beginning age, crying, birth, cooing at 6 weeks, babbling at 6 months, intonation pattern at 8 months, one word utterances at 1 year, two word utterances at 18 months, word inflections at 2 years, question negatives at 2 years and 3 months, rare or complex constructions were at 5 years, and mature speech came at 10 years. These stages are not language specific, although their actual realization obviously is. How the child constructs internal rules and how he or she adjusts from stage to stage is an internal mechanism common to all learners. However, one is not aware of what actually these mechanisms are. The second aspect was the creativity of learners. With Chomsky's criticism of Skinner's verbal behavior in 1957 came the notion of creativity of children. He stressed the fact that in language learning, learners were active contributors and minimized the importance attributed to imitation and reinforcement. He claimed that children have an innate faculty, which he called language acquisition device, LAD, which guided them in the learning of a language. The LAD contained a universal grammar, that is, a set of innate linguistic principles which comprised the initial stage and which controlled the form which the sentences of any language could take. Also, the children possessed a set of discovery procedures for relating the universal principle to the data provided by exposure to natural language. According to Chomsky in 1966, the LAD did not shape the process of acquisition. The input the child receives triggers the universal grammar with the help of which it produces sentence. Children create new sentences which they have never learned before. For example, the utterances such as "mummy good," "chair there" is the result of internalization of rules rather than mere habit formation. Given the complexity of the abstraction of rules, whether it is in the formation of sentences, questions, or the use of prepositions, it is amazing how learners master them given the limited amount of input provided. The concept of errors also received a different treatment from Chomsky. Children did make errors that were corrected only by their linguistic forms and not for the value or meaning it embedded. It was also observed that these corrections had very little effect on the development of language structure. The child would be in a position to utter correct grammatical structures only after the internalized rules were mastered. Now let's look at the impact of the mentalist theory on second language acquisition. Second language acquisition research received a great boost by two landmark articles: The Significance of Errors by Pete Corder in 1967 and Larry Selinker's Interlanguage published in 1972. These and other studies emphasize the systematic development of second language featuring L2 specific regularities such as interlanguage developmental sequences. The studies concerned investigated acquisition of progressive ing and plurals s and es, possessives and third person singular present, which revealed the existence of a unique L2 development order. This proved significant as it confirmed that L2 development needs to be seen as an independent area of inquiry and not always through the lenses of L1 study. Cognitive Maturity and Superior Literacy, published by Creation in 1973, challenged the neurological explanation on language development given by Lenberg in 1966. He argued that the cortical lateralization of the brain occurs much earlier, that is, before the age of 5, without any evidence of loss of any abilities. If we reflect on the development of second language in a child, he/she does not have to start from tabula rasa of knowing nothing about the language. The child has undergone the process of learning the language once. Most importantly, these learners already have within themselves a linguistic system. They are older, more mature than L1 learners and therefore had advantages that age confers on them in terms of working memory, conceptualization and social development, command of speech styles. They are also likely to have enhanced metalinguistic knowledge, larger repertoire of learning techniques and problem solving skills, increased mental capacity to deal with abstract concepts, especially the grammatical rules. Much of the maturation process then is transformation. It is not a sudden change but continuous process. His or her language continuum, the universal grammar, is in a state of constant development growing towards adult formal operational system. Coming to issues of errors. When one deals with SLA, an important issue that comes to the forefront is the issue of errors. Corder first suggested that a better understanding of language learning would come from a more systematic investigation of learner error by discovering the built-in syllabus of learners. He was the first researcher to suggest that errors did not originate in the L1. The predictions that language errors originate due to the interference of L1 seem to be unfounded, as a majority of the errors showed that errors could not be traced to L1. The logical question was that if errors could not be traced to L1, then from where did they originate? The characteristics of errors were not like the target language or L1. Therefore, the researchers concluded that their source must be internal, that is, within the learner. By 1972, Selinker came up with the notion of interlanguage, which referred to the language produced by learners both as a system which can be described at any point in time, resulting from systematic rules, and as a series of interlocking systems that characterized learner progression. In other words, it emphasized two fundamental notions. The language produced by learners is a system in its own right, obeying its own rule, and secondly, it is a dynamic system evolving over a period of time. He postulated the view that second language utterances of learners do not conform to adult speech, nor are they exact translations of the native language. They differed from their target language in systematic ways, yet they were not produced randomly. The relevant data of the second language learning must be the speech forms which results from the attempted expression of meaning in second language. Errors which were considered as signals of non-learning of L2 by the behaviorists were now viewed in isolation but were now considered inevitable value aspects of learning evolving out of their developing interlanguage. The fluctuating nature of the emerging language system was termed as transitional competence, idiosyncratic dialects and learner language by Pitt Corder, or approximative system by Nemser in 1971. Interlanguage research revealed that the learner's degree of proficiency can legitimately be conceived as a system created by the learner himself, herself, which is distinct from L1 or L2. The system is not invariant, although it may have relatively fixed defects which are usually referred to as fossilization. Social theories and its impact on SLA. In the course of some years, a new strand of thinking developed in which theorists viewed language learning in terms of social interaction. Certain theorists were of the opinion that language acquisition was the result of interaction between the learner's mental ability and the linguistic environment. The Swiss psychologist Jean Piaget's work attained importance because it offered a broader scope of understanding of language acquisition. The developmental instructional approach assumed that language learning was dependent on a number of factors like social, linguistic, maturational, biological, cognitive factors, which all affected the course of development. Vygotsky, a Soviet psychologist, was also of the opinion that these factors helped language learning, and the interaction between children and adults continually developed and modified these factors. Social interaction begins from the time the baby is born, and the child's language development begins in terms of the functions that they want to express. According to Halliday, initially the functions can be grouped into 6 categories that simultaneously and gradually developed into 3 adult functions. They are as follows: interpersonal, relating to people; ideational, communicating ideas to other people; textual, relating one piece of language to the other. In L1 acquisition, social interaction is emphasized the significance of instances when parents, adults or caregivers provide speech of special nature called motherese or child-directed speech. If one observes the characteristics of the language spoken by adults with babies, one notices that grammatical structures are simplified, baby talk vocabulary is used, a lot of structures and sentences are repeated. Questions that are frequently framed and used are: what are you doing, dear? आप क्या कर रहे हैं? ऐसा नहीं करते. Stop struggling your brother. The intonation is exaggerated, there is extra loudness in the voice, and the tempo of language is slow with long pauses. The conversational structure seems to assign an interactive role to the young child even before he or she has become a speaking participant. For example, a child may be asked, "What are you doing? Have you gotten up? Here, don't cry. Let me give you another bowl of milk." As the child grows older and begins to use language, the language of the elders becomes elaborate. There is also evidence to suggest that motherese also affects the rate of acquisition of the language. These studies suggest that the way mothers talk with their children influences the rapidity with which they acquire language. However, the key input is interactional rather than formal. It is the mother's choice of discourse to use questions, commands, and clarifications, acknowledgements that provide the right kind of input to foster L1 development. Quality and quantity of input encountered by the child is another important factor responsible for L1 acquisition. The behaviorists were of the view that linguistic environment was important in terms of stimulus and response. The mentalists minimized the role of input and explained language development primarily in terms of learner's internal processing system. The interactionist view sees language development as the result of both the input factors and the innate mechanisms. Language acquisition, according to them, was derived from collaborative efforts of the learners and his or her interlocutors and involves a dynamic interplay between external and internal factors. Thus, the role of linguistic environment in L1 acquisition seems to serve more than a trigger to activate the innate processing mechanisms, leading to an interactionist interpretation of development. This brings us to the end of part 2.